the sweeping Lake Huron and Georgian Bay shoreline and the Niagara Escarpment that runs up the peninsula and ancient cedars that cling to the cliffs. And then all of those pieces kind of combine. So the forests, alvars, inland and coastal wetlands, all are critically important for birds, reptiles, at-risk and globally rare plants, as well as wide-ranging mammals. And the peninsula, I grew up in Owen Sound, and I live there now, and spent many summers working up in Tobermory, so I've spent a lot of time on the peninsula, and I'm certainly glad to be able to work somewhere that I care about and have spent so much time. So in terms of conservation in action, some of the things that we've worked on and are currently working on the peninsula, we've helped to protect over 5,000 hectares, specifically on the peninsula, and we actively steward over 2,000 hectares. We focus a fair bit on habitat restoration, and a lot of that is through invasive species control, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Other things include working alongside Saugeen and Ojibwe Nation, both from that habitat restoration perspective and largely Phragmites control, species at risk surveys, and looking at securement opportunities as well. And we collaborate with conservation partners, whether that's other private conservation organizations, different levels of government, and community organizations as well. And then just wanted to take a second to highlight some of our recent acquisitions. I'm sure many of you know Esme Batten, my colleague. She's the program director for Midwestern Ontario. I'm filling in for her today. She's actually on Coburn Island, so. But she's been quite busy. A lot of recent acquisitions over the past couple of years on the peninsula, which obviously is someone who actively stewards the properties. That's my main role. Is obviously really exciting. So a couple of them, looking at the first one here, Maryville Creek. So this property is near Chesley Lake, just north of Highway 21. It came to us through a donation through the Canadian Ecological Gifts Program. And we took possession, I guess, close to 3 years ago now. The property is 33 hectares total, and contains a part of the provincially significant Maryville Creek wetland complex, and provides great habitat for forest birds, really beautiful mature hemlock trees and giant maples on the property, so it's a beautiful spot. Kind of moving north a little bit, Sturgeon Bay Forest is one of our more recent acquisitions. So this property was purchased in 2023, the end of 2023. It's just north of Wyerton. You're kind of overlooking Polpoise Bay there. It's just over 60 hectares, a really nice mosaic of coniferous and deciduous forests. It's, I think, really important. It's adjacent to Bruce Trail property and quite close to other conservation lands, so it creates a really nice east-west movement corridor and provides important habitat for large and wide-ranging mammals like black bear. And then finally, kind of moving all the way up to the tip of the peninsula, we have the Baptist Harbor Alvar property. So this one was acquired 2 years ago, just under 30 hectares. It's really unique in the sense it's got over 1 kilometer of undeveloped Lake Huron shoreline. No surprise, Alvar is on the property as well. And I think one of the more exciting things is it adds to a fairly large existing conservation corridor in the Cape Breton area. We own a fair number of properties there. EBC, Nature Conservancy does, Ontario Nature, Ontario Heritage Trust, and there's over 600 hectares of conservation lands just in Cape Breton alone. So that's a very quick snapshot in terms of NCC and what we do. But why am I here talking about invasive species if we're a land conservation organization? First and foremost, our main focus is on protecting biodiversity. So looking at different threats of biodiversity, there was a report released a couple of years ago that looked at the threats to biodiversity globally. And through that, obviously, findings included things like nature's declining at rates unprecedented in human history, and 1 million plants and animal species are currently threatened with extinction. And it also highlighted main threats to biodiversity. That includes things like habitat loss and degradation, natural resource exploitation, climate change. And these are things we typically address through our land conservation work. Obviously protecting land from habitat loss, degradation, exploitation, and climate change indirectly. But another one on that list is invasive species. So traditionally, we've controlled invasive species on our own properties, on a property by property basis. But understanding that's obviously a small snapshot of the bigger picture, and understanding we're not just concerned about the health of our properties, but protecting the full natural area or the peninsula that we work within. So with that in mind, we kind of expanded and started to do more landscape scale invasive species control. So I'll talk more about that program just in a couple minutes, but first, just wanting to provide a bit more context in terms of, what are invasive species. So really there's kind of two key things that make a species an invasive species. First being that it is non-native or alien to the ecosystem under consideration, so let's say Ontario in this case, and whose introduction will cause harm to the environment and or economy or society. So it's obviously those two things that make a species an invasive species versus a non-native or simply just an alien species. So this slide doesn't have too much, but really an invasive species is any sort of living organism. So whether that's a fish or invertebrate, a plant, an insect, a pathogen, or a land animal or terrestrial invertebrates. And invasive species, they impact the landscape on a number of different ways, both visually and beyond. So I've just got a couple of examples of fairly common invasive species that we have on the peninsula and kind of, what you tend to see when you see them. So on the screen here is garlic mustard. Plants, typically you're getting that really high monoculture, really dense, taking over an area, and that's huge in terms of just the visual impact of the disturbance. Garlic mustard on the peninsula is of specific concern because it invades forest floors, and it doesn't require disturbed areas to become established. And obviously, if you're thinking about the peninsula and the 42 native orchid species that we have, for example, garlic mustard can pose a significant threat to those species. This is a picture that's of a woodlot and kind of a scene that's fairly common in southern Ontario, especially as you kind of move off of the peninsula. So that's a woodlot with a lot of dead ash trees, obviously. So the culprit being the emerald ash borer in the top right corner there. So this was a species introduced probably in the early 2000s, 2002, and once it's present in an area, it essentially kills 99% of mature ash trees within an 8 to 10 year period. So you're obviously looking at the impact of this invasive species, and you don't see the species itself, but obviously the direct result of the damage that it does. And then the third example here is of quagga mussels. So this was stolen from the All Too Clear documentary, Inspired Planet Productions. Zach and Yvonne live on the peninsula. They do fantastic work. So I stole a screenshot from their new video here. This is Lake Michigan or Lake Huron, I'm not sure to be honest, but obviously the lake bed is covered in quagga mussels, similar to zebra mussel, but typically are found in deeper waters, so somewhere from 20 to 30 meters up to 100 meters. And really what they do is outcompete native species for food source, so they are hyper filterers, removing plankton from the water body. And it's estimated that there are quadrillions of quagga mussels in the Great Lakes, and in a week's time, all of the water within Lake Michigan would pass through a mussel and be filtered. So kind of impacts, obviously these are lurking below the surface, you don't really see them, but it does have an impact obviously on water clarity. So increasing clarity of the water, so you see again a result of the species rather than the species itself. So in terms of invasive species, how do they get here, in short? Historically, the spread was facilitated by the collapse of barriers, whether that was a physical barrier or a climatic barrier. Obviously, the second one's a bit more of a concern as we're dealing with the changing climate and ranges of different species are changing. But really, invasive species as we know them now, a human-caused problem. We're responsible for the vast majority of the spread. And really, it's broken down into two categories. You're looking at intentional spread or unintentional spread. So the chart on the right-hand side was pulled from a report from the CFIA focusing on invasive alien plant species. And you have the different pathways of intentional introduction and unintentional introduction. So intentional, really the main culprit is horticulture or ornamental plants. But different ways are, agricultural crops, plants for soil improvement, erosion control, etc. And a couple different smaller categories there. So one we don't deal with here, but if you think of kudzu vine, obviously down south, it's one that you see a lot more. It kind of falls into a couple of those intentional introduction categories. It was brought over in the late 1800s as an ornamental plant, but by the 1920s and 30s, it was actually pushed and championed as a great forage crop. It's a legume, so it's a nitrogen fixer, grows quickly, quite drought resistant. So it was pushed in that sense, and then the Soil Conservation Corps actually pushed it as a way for soil improvement to prevent rilling and rutting and gullying of eroded fields, as well as for erosion along road right-of-ways and railway right-of-ways as well. So, and then looking at...
Excuse me.
Yeah.
What were you just talking about? What plant were you just talking about?
Kudzu?
Oh, right.
Fine, yeah.
Yep.
So southern states more so
Yep.
than up here. But. And then looking at unintentional introduction. So I think as we become more aware of what invasive species are, that first category of intentional introduction really decreasing. But we're dealing with more unintentional or non-purposeful introduction. A lot of that is through goods being brought in, whether that's plant products, contaminated in the seed, forage produce, wood products, shipping pallets, those types of things. But other include livestock or animals in soil, sand, or gravel, including ballast soil and these different types of areas. And then another big one, not shown on this chart because it's for plants, but ballast water, especially when you're looking at the Great Lakes, a really big concern there in terms of introduction to freshwater ecosystems. So just a very quick snapshot in terms of the current state of invasive species. It's hard to get an exact number, but in terms of the estimated invasive plant species in Ontario, we're looking at over 440 individual plant species, over 180 non-native and invasive aquatic species, and just highlighting some of the new ones that we're kind of seeing. So hydrilla is a new one. It was just found in Hillman Marsh, which is just on Lake Erie. It was just found this summer for the first time in Canada, so obviously we're still getting new ones. 39 forest insects. So
What is hydrilla?
it's a submerged, emergent aquatic vegetation.
A fish?
No, vegetation.
Vegetable?
Yeah. So it's typical of an invasive species, outcompetes native vegetation, creates these really dense mats, prevents sunlight from penetrating and other plants from growing, and can cause significant trouble from a recreational standpoint, boating, that type of stuff. Really dense mats of vegetation. So there's an estimated 39 forest insects in Ontario that are invasive. Talked about the emerald ash borer. Hemlock woolly adelgid is a new one, or a newer one that we're starting to see. It's been around since kind of mid 2015s, let's say 2012, 2013. but we're starting to see, as of the last couple of years, it kind of extending from its more southern range a bit more into Ontario, and obviously it's targeting our hemlock trees. And then tree diseases, which are fairly nasty, but a new one is oak wilt, which was just noticed in Ontario and Canada for the first time last year. So lots of invasive species that are present and still dealing with new infestations. So when we look at the damage that's caused by invasive species, it's hard to quantify the environmental damage. Obviously, it has, they have significant impacts from outcompeting native species, impacts to food chains, and overall ecosystem health. But looking at it from a dollars and cents perspective, there was a report that was done in 2019 that tried to quantify the damage caused by invasive species. And this is an estimate. It used a lot of different models or estimates from different areas and applied it to Ontario as best as it could. But what they did and determined was about a $3.6 billion per year impact caused by invasive species. And largely that's shared across three categories, the main one being forestry. You think about the damage that emerald ash borer does in terms of killing 99% of trees within an 8 to 10 year period. So you have really significant impacts in that sense, and obviously just the economic size of the forestry industry. But then also looking at fisheries and agriculture and understanding the impact there. So about $1 billion between the two. A smaller amount to tourism or recreation, and then a very small amount to healthcare. Thinking about things like harm to body from like giant hogweed, for example, that type of thing. And kind of touched on it, but this $3.6 billion value does not include the value of losses in biodiversity, ecosystem services, as well as aesthetics. And then finally, just kind of putting that into perspective, $3.6 billion is a lot of money. When the report was published, Ontario's GDP was just over $800 billion, so you're looking at close to 0.5% of Ontario's GDP. So obviously we know invasive species are bad. What can we do in terms of preventing and dealing with them if they do become established within an area? So this chart was pulled from a report put together by the Office of the Auditor General, looking at invasive management across Ontario. And it kind of starts to highlight the economic return on action based on when you act for an invasive species. So obviously prevention is the best. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So really looking at preventing an invasive species from becoming established in an area. If obviously the species becomes introduced, you're looking at eradicating it as soon as possible. Obviously, small populations are manageable from an economic kind of input perspective. And then as you expand, obviously the return is lessening and lessening, and you're spending a fair bit of money, time, and effort to control invasive species once they become established within an area. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of more of that containment and long-term control and management. But just wanting to highlight a couple of examples where prevention and eradication have proved effective. So prevention, one tool is through legislation and enforcement. And the chart on the right shows the cumulative number of invasive species within the Great Lakes ecosystem over a number of years. And wanting to highlight ballast water regulation that was put into effect. So obviously we have a fairly gentle increase of invasive species, and that blue line indicates in the 1950s when the St. Lawrence Seaway was widened and you're accepting larger transport ships and more kind of transcontinental movement of goods into the Great Lakes waterways. So obviously when that happens, we have a huge spike in terms of the amount of invasive species we're seeing. And it was determined that was largely related to ballast water within ships. So obviously ships pull in water if they don't have a load to maintain stability, and then release that water once they pick up whatever goods they are carrying. So obviously if you're sucking in water from one freshwater ecosystem, moving it to another and releasing it, not going to be good because you get a lot of hitchhikers. And it was estimated that upwards of 80% of all invasive species in the Great Lakes have been introduced through ballast water. That includes things like quagga mussels and zebra mussels, the round goby, and a number of other species. So they introduced a regulation which prevented that, the release of fresh water from another area into our freshwater ecosystem. But what it didn't address was the fact that ships that had a load still had a little bit of water in their ballast, as well as sediment, and a lot of invasive species were kind of hiding and hanging out within that sediment. And as soon as you're taking on ballast water in that freshwater ecosystem, and if you're going somewhere within that ecosystem and again dumping it out, you're essentially washing all of that out and putting it back in. So they actually amended it to include the swish and spit method. So what that means is if a ship was in the middle of the ocean and had a load of goods, it would have otherwise been exempt from the regulation, but now they're required to pull in salt water, rinse it around, and then spit it back out. And obviously fresh water life doesn't survive within a saline environment. So the swish and spit method that was introduced in 2005, and that red line indicates when it came in, and obviously you're seeing a fairly significant plateau of invasive species being introduced. And then eradication. Ontario, the Asian longhorn beetle, it's another forest pest, targets hardwoods, largely maple trees. So obviously you think about the damage that's done from the emerald ash borer, and we have things like the butternut canker and beech bark disease and all of these different things that target individual tree species. So certainly the last thing we need is another specialized pest destroying our maple trees. Obviously from a forestry perspective, that's a huge potential impact. Maple syrup as well. So 2 infestations were found in 2003 and 2013 in the GTA, and CFIA was able to act quite quickly in terms of identifying a contamination zone and preventing really the movement of wood, or regulating the movement of wood within these zones. And no observations have been seen since 2015, so obviously successfully at this point have eradicated the Asian longhorn beetle. So good, just kind of 2 localish examples of where prevention and eradication have been effective at preventing introduction of invasive species. But unfortunately, a lot of the times that's not the case. We do get invasive species, they become established, and you're looking at different control methods and opportunities. So there's really kind of 3 buckets in terms of invasive species control. This is by no means comprehensive, but some different options, and really from left to right, you're looking at the most labor intensive down to the least labor intensive. So mechanical includes things like pulling, mowing, cutting, whether that's by hand, using handheld equipment, or larger pieces of equipment. The photo on the bottom left is a photo of a truxer. So that's a specialized piece of amphibious equipment that's used to cut Phragmites that's growing in water. And then obviously scoops up that biomass and removes it from site for proper disposal. And then you have chemical as an option. So mechanical, sometimes it's not feasible, it's not practical, it's not effective. So chemical is an option, and that includes for plant species, you're looking at things like herbicide, and then obviously fungicide and insecticide for different invasive species. And the photo there is showing a fat truck with herbicide application occurring to a large dense stand of Phragmites. And then finally, biological control agents. So that's introducing another species that's non-native to the area typically as a biocontrol agent. Typically parasitoids or predators. In this example, I'm not going to try and pronounce the Latin word for the beetle, but we released a beetle that predates on purple loosestrife on the peninsula. So we worked with the Bruce Peninsula National Park for that release in targeted areas. And obviously this approach, once you get to the point of the biocontrol agent being approved for use, it's a quite hands-off other than the release. So minimal effort and investment other than kind of routine and regular monitoring to see effectiveness. And I should say all of these kind of make up an integrated pest management strategy. So every site, when you're looking at invasive species control, you're kind of determining based on site conditions which tools in the toolbox you can use to most effectively, efficiently, and responsibly control invasive species.
Have they found something for Phragmites?
Yes.
In terms of
The biocontrol agent? Yeah, so there's parasitic wasps. I believe that they are doing kind of targeted releases. They've been doing it for a couple of years, so yeah, it's kind of in its infancy in terms of control effectiveness there, but yeah.
And what about, have they found chemicals?
For her, yeah, I'll talk a little bit about kind of that, but yeah, so there's different herbicides you can use for Phragmites, whether it's terrestrial or on dry land, and there is one herbicide you can use in aquatic environments where cut to drown is not efficient or effective. Cutting to drown, you need a sufficient depth of water for it to really be effective, because essentially what you're doing is preventing photosynthesis and preventing oxygen from getting to that root system. But if you're in shallow depths of water, the frag's just going to pop right out quite quickly, and you're really not going to get much in terms of effective control. So in that instance, there is a herbicide, Habitat Aqua, that is effective at controlling over water. So kind of all that's a brief overview of invasive species. So kind of bringing it back to what we're doing, NCC, on the landscape in terms of invasive species control. So like I mentioned, our focus is typically on land conservation, but understanding that invasive species pose that significant threat to biodiversity. Understood that we had to do more on a landscape scale. And with that understanding, we initiated the Saugeen Peninsula Invasive Species Program in 2020 to implement landscape scale control. And we wanted to take a collaborative approach. So working with a range of organizations that share a common interest in invasive species control, whether that's municipal level or county level governments, other conservation organizations, community groups, and private landowners as well. And through this, we really focused on high priority invasive species for the peninsula. So starting top left and working clockwise, we have dog strangling vine, common buckthorn, invasive Phragmites, and garlic mustard. And those species were chosen for a couple different reasons. One of those being, the threat that they pose. I talked about garlic mustard and the threat to undisturbed forest floors and things like orchid species. Dog strangling vine, we've seen huge infestations in Alvars in the Cardin area near Barrie where we work. And obviously we have really high quality alvar habitats we want to protect, so preventing the establishment and proliferation of dog strangling vine. And then looking at Phragmites, obviously significant detrimental impacts to coastal wetlands, inland wetlands, and obviously the importance they provide to a healthy ecosystem, including things like the migratory stopover for birds. So while we've worked kind of on all four of those species, really, I'm just here to talk about Phragmites. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Phragmites is a perennial wetland grass. It's nasty, it's big, it's tall. It spreads in three ways, largely seeds, stolon, and rhizomes. So seeds obviously creates these big seed heads. Stolons, the picture on the left kind of shows that. So that's a plant that's growing horizontally, and at each node you get a new shoot. So that's a really big way it spreads in water bodies, and especially like the Lake Huron and Georgian Bay shoreline. A piece can get knocked off by wave action, float away, and roots and start seeing colony. And then rhizomes, big underground root systems that are established. So Phrag's a little bit, not quite like an iceberg, but there is quite a large root system underground, and it spreads aggressively through those rhizomes. And then, like I mentioned, it's thick. The middle photo is me in the middle of a patch of Phrag fighting through it. Phragma is the Greek word for fence. and it certainly feels like that. Likely how it got introduced, again, ornamental grass, quite pretty with the big seed head when it, the sun blows on it, and good for privacy fencing and grows quickly. But it's obviously quite difficult to get through, not only for humans, but for wildlife. And it causes, huge environmental, economic, and social harm. It grows extremely dense, creates monocultures, wildlife can't get through it, doesn't provide much in terms of ecosystem services, alters water hydrology, and then you look at things like social and economic impacts. From a recreation perspective, impacts fisheries, just general enjoyment, swimming, boating, those types of things, but also causes safety concerns along roadsides, decreased sight lines, fire hazards, all these different types of things. So obviously, Phragmites is a fairly big control, and really what we spend the bulk of our time on when we're actually out there doing invasive species control. So our program, we've been able to offer free control services across the peninsula, and really that's on our lands, on partner lands, private property, as well as seeking out control opportunities on crown lands and on public land as well. So when we do Phragmites control, we complete that both via mechanical and chemical methods. And like I mentioned briefly, those methods are largely chosen based on an assessment of site and sand conditions, landowner wishes, the feasibility of control, etc. Mechanical, you're really limited to Phragmites growing in water, using that cut to drown method, either by hand or using the Trexer machines that we have a contractor come in and do that work. And then chemical, using that where mechanical is not efficient or not possible, and it's still safe and environmentally responsible to use herbicides. So we do this work across the landscape. Some days we're lucky and we get to work beautiful areas like the top left there along the Georgian Bay shoreline. Other days we're doing frag control on roadsides, which is really important. Obviously, the big spread vector roads are. But really, a lot of the time we're spent controlling frag in quite remote areas and wetlands. Obviously, the peninsula is a little forest, with wetlands interspersed and not a lot of trails. So a lot of time bushwhacking and kind of getting those small and medium density stands, taking that early detection and rapid response in terms of nipping it in the bud, so to say, before it becomes a bigger infestation within some of these wetlands. So just kind of some examples of where we work across the peninsula.
Where's that one on the right?
The right, that's 40 Hills Road.
I was just going to ask you that.
Yeah, I would imagine most people know.
I was going to say, it's still there, is it? I mean,
Yeah,
it's been there for years, and I keep wondering when it's...
Yeah, so 40 Hills Road, it's interesting. So if you're driving north, this is looking north. On the right-hand side, it's all invasive Phragmites, and on the left-hand side, it's native frag. So we don't control native frag. It's obviously native to the area. It doesn't have those same aggressive tendencies that invasive frag does. So we have controlled the stuff on the the right-hand side. If you're going north, I guess the east. Ideally, we do get down and cut down that dead standing biomass to help with natural regeneration and make retreatment easier. But I would say 95% is treated and dead. So yeah.
I mean, I was always concerned about it because of it being so close to the road.
Yes.
And getting picked up in tires and things.
Well, exactly. Yeah. It squeezes the road a little bit, and then roads again, spread vectors, tires, grading, all that type of stuff. So that's kind of work we do across the peninsula. But I did want to just take a minute or two to highlight the work that we've done at Oliphant and been involved with. So this is kind of the largest scale stuff that we've been able to contribute to. And Oliphant, I'm sure all of you know where it is. It's a coastal community north of Saugeen Beach there. As of 2015, 2016, Phragmites have become a really big issue, environmentally, but also from a safety perspective, really choking out boat channels, making it quite unsafe in certain areas. So some residents, mainly led by Leslie Wood, formed the Oliphant Fishing Islands Phragmites Community Group, understanding that something needed to be done and moving forward with control. And this work has been ongoing since 2017 and it's been supported by a number of organizations. That includes groups like the Great Saltwater Conservation Authority, the Town of South Bruce, All the Campers Association, Bruce Peninsula Biosphere, local businesses, individual landowners donating time and money. So it's really been a community and collaborative effort in terms of control there.
I love the top picture.
It's a very, no, it's a great one. I guess water levels have changed so much too, so there's some photos of people kind of up to their neck cutting frag. It's not quite that dire anymore as water levels have obviously receded quite drastically. So I just have some kind of before and after photos to run through showing the success of Phragmites control. The before photos aren't like a great representation because a lot of them were taken in 2021 and 2022 after 3 or 4 years of frag control. But I still think paint a really good picture in terms of what it looks like now. So obviously all of the vegetation you're seeing kind of in the fore and mid-ground is dense Phragmites. And then a photo taken this year, obviously a significant reduction in that density. We have little bits and pieces popping up, but you know, a huge reduction in the amount of frag there. And this photo, kind of behind it is the Elephant Fen and the boardwalk just on the other side of the road. So a really beautiful ecosystem there and really wanting to protect it from the threat of frag. This is kind of further out into the islands, looking at Cranberry Island, one of the bigger islands out there. So everything kind of, again, your mid-ground and foreground is frag. And then looking at that location a couple years later, pretty much all gone. So great progress there. And then this is the main boat channel. The locals call it the gut. This was again after a number of years of cutting frag. So before the channel had pretty much been overrun by frag, you had enough to squeeze a boat or two through. So a significant reduction, but a lot of that green that you're seeing along the berms and encroaching into the gut is frag. And then again, looking this past year, obviously a huge reduction in terms of the amount of frag. So it's been, I think, a really encouraging example of large-scale invasive species control and large-scale frag control on the peninsula. It's anticipated after this year there will be less than 5 hectares of frag remaining, and that's probably greater than 95% reduction from pre-2017 levels. So obviously a huge amount of work, more than 90 volunteers and 9,000 volunteer hours that went into this, as well as contractor costs and other staff time. But I think a really great example of a collaborative effort and actually making significant progress in terms of controlling a fairly established population.
Once you clear it out,
Yep.
Do you monitor it for a certain period of time and have to go back?
Yeah, so it's ongoing now. Obviously, the interconnected nature of Lake Huron with other areas, you're going to get frag becoming reestablished, and you're going to get regrowth. So that's kind of where we're at now, where in some ways it's easier when you have big patches to control. Now you're kind of doing a fine-tooth comb approach, and that's certainly what we'll be doing over the next couple of years. So there's still more work to do, and we're committed to doing it. And we're actually looking at, we received funding to do some active restoration, so reseeding and that type of stuff to help with that natural regeneration, which does occur, and we've seen NCC, my colleagues have done large-scale frag control in the Long Point region, and you do get that natural regeneration, but wanting to kickstart it a little bit. But in short, yes, there's going to be continued efforts. I don't think we're ever going to get eradication of Phragmites, but Elephant's a great example of, you get really great community buy-in. So you have kind of these monitors, and people know what to look for and are actively invested and are out there cutting frag and letting us know where it is for control where it can't be cut. So yeah.
So when the Phragmite is harvested,
Yep.
seed pods are still on the top. What do you do to it?
Yeah, so I'll go back maybe a little bit here. So kind of the middle and the bottom photo really show when it was largely mechanical control here. You're cutting everything and you're removing all of that biomass, and they took it to the dump actually, and placed it there. So frag, I think the main spread vector is largely through your stolons and your rhizomes. So the seed heads are a concern, but largely what that material was, it was placed at the dump, monitored. You'll get a little bit of regrowth that's controlled to prevent any new growth. But the big thing is just removing that biomass from the site and placing it in an area that's not wet, that's not going to regrow.
Well, what I was curious about is there any sort of a native plant that you can reintroduce to dampen the regrowth?
Yeah, it's a great question. In short, not that I'm aware of. Yeah, frag, due to its quite aggressive growth patterns and characteristics, chokes out native species, and obviously that's part of the work that we do. I don't think we'll ever, get rid of Phragmites completely in Ontario or Canada or anything like that. But obviously the introduction of invasive species, it's just been ramped up due to human nature and all of that. So really what we're trying to do is buy nature a bit of time, right? There will become a bit of a balance presumably, and but right now looking at the threat to biodiversity and understanding we need to protect these areas, especially wetlands, from that threat to biodiversity. So to answer your question, no, I'm not aware. I don't believe there is.
Okay, I wasn't either, but
Yeah.
I thought maybe you would.
No, unfortunately not.
Do you have any idea if they're doing anything about it on the whole 400 series of highways?
Yes, they are a little bit. So MTO does do Phragmites control on the Peninsula. I can't speak for them, but my understanding is they're kind of taking a rolling approach. They do it every 2 years here. So this year they did do Phragmites control on Highway 6. As for the 400 series of highways, I don't know. I know it's...
They're just mowing it.
Yeah.
It's huge.
Yeah, it's drastic. I mean, you leave the peninsula and you drive on, a lot of the series of highways, and it's a wall, right? So it's a concern, and we're lucky on the peninsula in terms of the amount of frag we have is fairly small outside of all of Finton. I mean, there's frag everywhere, but compared to other areas in southern Ontario, we're in good shape. So yes,
I got a bit of a case history, Jacob.
Okay.
I live on Sky Lake
Okay.
on the Rankin system, and I think it was about 3 years ago I was in communication with you about a sort of island of Phragmites that was growing, inaccessible by land, inaccessible by water, and we got into a situation that it might be possible to eradicate this particular, there are two quite large groups, by spraying, by chemical means. I heard nothing more about that in the end, but as a corollary to that, I noticed that last year there was an offspring growth right along the north shore of Sky Lake that you had people come in, or somebody had people in to cut those down. But I don't know what happened to the original, because it seems to me that the earlier you get onto one of these things, the better it is.
So the Skyboat Lake Isaac Lake complex there is certainly an area we're interested in doing frag control. We've done some mechanical control and dryland spraying. There has been concerns from some groups about using Habitat Aqua, so that aquatic herbicide, specific to specific plants and the nature of that ecosystem. So we're taking a cautious approach certainly there. It's something that's on our radar. I would love to get rid of it. I mean, all of Sky, Isaac, and Boat Lake have frag.
Well, the west end has been looked after by the residents, and the reason they could do it was that the floor of the lake there is quite firm. Well, the bit that I'm talking about, there's about 3 feet of water and then about another 3 feet of mud. And these Phragmites are growing through or on the vegetable mat that's on top of it.
That's
Can't get at it at all by any other means.
It grows on the floating mats, and I mean, you can't cut to drown that. It's not very safe in terms of trying mechanical control. So it's an instance where chemical control is really the only feasible option in terms of eradication. If you're looking at managing and preventing spread, you could look at mechanical control, but you're not going to get eradication there. So in short, we're working through some things there, and yes, we're quite hopeful that we'll be able to do control. It's on my radar. I do promise.
There's another thing that I came across only a couple of years ago. I noticed that there are several growths of Phragmites in the other end, but then it's not the same species. There's a native species
Yes.
of Phragmites that you have to be careful to leave alone.
Yeah. So
Because they
especially-
don't crowd in like the alien does.
No. So yeah, Sky Lake especially, I've noticed there's a lot more of that American frag or native frag. So it can be kind of tricky to tell the difference, but really the easiest way is by September. Later September, the native frag has started to senesce or die off and brown, whereas the invasive frag is more hardy. It's light frost tolerant, so it'll stay green into October. So that's kind of the ways you can really tell it. But yeah, it's a mix in there, and yeah, hopeful next year that we'll actually get into do.
Can I just mention one other thing? I've heard rumours somewhere that there might be in the offing some kind of moth
Yes.
that actually can attack the
Yeah.
Phragmites.
So I think I misspoke. I said wasp, but yes, moth. So there's a couple different moth species. Again, they've done release. I think they've done maybe 40 or 50 different test sites, kind of since 2022, and it predates on frag. So starting to get there in terms of that biocontrol, and it's more so something that's going to manage existing populations versus eradicate huge standing populations. But again, another tool in the toolbox, and really prevents that.
I know that beetle thing worked miracles on the purple loosestrife.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Although this year seemed to be a good year for purple loosestrife. I don't know.
Sorry.
Yes.
When you say the moth predates on the Phragmites, what does that look like?
I don't want to misspeak and get into technicalities that I know, but essentially the larva it gets placed within the frag. I'm not going to get the terms right,
Okay.
and then eats its way out essentially in the following year.
And kills the frag.
Kills the frag. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
No worries.
Well,
And then finally, I promised my last slide here, but this really just shows kind of overall project results. A summary from 2020 to 2023 doesn't include this year, but as a roll-up, we've controlled about 250 hectares of frag across the peninsula. That includes us as well as our contractor. A lot of that work's been done in Oliphant, as you can tell by the pink blob kind of middle left portion of the map. But we kind of work tip to tail, so all the way to the top of the peninsula down to Highway 21. We've engaged with a number of different properties, and we've completed control on roadsides, county properties, conservation lands, private properties, crown land, other private conservation land, etc. So, yeah, really starting to make good progress. Certainly more work to be done, but yeah, we're committed, and we thankfully have funding for I think at least another 3 or 4 years. So we're going to keep chipping away at frag on the peninsula. So that's it for me.
Do you have any more questions for Jacob? He's got a few minutes. Couple?
Oh yeah, of course.
Well, I
Yes.
have one, I don't know if it applies to many other people here, but we have a property, old pasture surrounded by Ansi.
Okay.
And one of the things that I've noticed is there's this thing called canary grass.
Yeah.
And it seems like a close relative to frag, but
Yes. Yeah.
and it seems difficult to control in certain areas and seems invasive. Is that something that's on your radar?
Yeah. Reed canary grass. That's a tough one. It's invasive. Yeah. And it looks a lot like frag, especially in frag's early growth stage. It's not quite as aggressive in terms of like super dense growth as something like frag, but yeah, it's there. It's quite prevalent, especially areas like you
Forms
described
those
there.
maps.
Exactly. Yeah. So, in short, it is not something we're actively working
Not
on.
a major concern.
No, I mean, it's a concern, but obviously you're doing a bit of a triage approach in terms of what are the main threats, and
Yeah.
right now we're focusing
Yeah,
on right.
I don't think it actually enters the water.
No, it's
So that's-
terrestrial. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, wettish areas, but no, it's not growing
Yeah.
in water.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm listening to you talking about bringing beetles in for the purple sandstripe
Yep.
and the moss.
Yep.
And, okay, if they finished with the purple sandstripe, where are the beetles going next?
Yeah.
What's the control for the,
I'll say it's out of my pay grade a little bit in terms of that one, but they do go through a quite extensive review and testing process through the health agency, et cetera. So yeah, it's a concern, right? You don't want to create a bigger problem trying to solve an existing problem. So I'd say they do take an extreme amount of caution in terms of that, but my understanding is they understand, predation patterns. They've looked at all that. Will it feed on native species that we don't want them to? And obviously, you're looking at, potential unintended impacts and something that's addressed through that review process.
I got one more. It's
Sorry,
totally
I know
unrelated.
I've been jumping around just
Yeah.
So, on your list of invasive species, there are no mammals.
Yeah, no mammals listed there. Yeah, nutria is one, so kind of quite a large rodent. Wild boar is another one that's becoming, or wild pig that's becoming more prevalent in Canada, well, especially in the U.S. Again,
People are posting lots of pictures of possums and saying how cute they are.
Yeah.
And don't kill them.
Yeah.
Because we have a tick, and because of climate changes.
Yeah.
More ticks coming up, and then possums, which might be more native to southern states.
Yeah.
Are coming up.
Yeah.
And they're eating ticks, which is great, but.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much. I mean, I would maybe look at the distinction between an alien or non-native species and an invasive species, right? So isn't a possum coming up and causing harm to the ecosystem? I'm not well enough versed, to be honest, but I think maybe there is obviously that distinction there. And then when you're looking at invasive mammals, that's a whole other ballgame. Anything that moves versus a plant, right? Yeah, that's a whole other thing.
Humans would be on that invasive.
Yeah. I didn't want to bring that one up, but yes, that's correct. Sorry.
Yeah, totally different question.
Yep.
I'm curious about when all the ash trees die,
Yes.
which they are doing in our area now. Does that also mean the death of the ash borer? I mean, where do they go if there are no more ash trees?
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Or if so, maybe it will recirculate.
Yeah. I think like ash regenerates quite quickly. Number one, like you go into forests and you'll see a lot of young ash that's growing up and probably will become a good food source for the emerald ash borer, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, obviously that's a possibility. But then you're looking at the essentially extinction or local extinction of a population, and then the potential of having to reintroduce that. Yeah.
Okay,
Wow.
so thank you so
Good
much,
stuff.
Jacob. I'm sure he'll be here for a few minutes if you have a couple lingering questions. You can talk to him afterwards. In the meantime, I just want to let everyone know that this has been, it's on YouTube, okay? And if you want to go back and look and maybe you forgot about something, it'll be on our YouTube channel, BPEG. In order for us to have live showings of it, we need a minimum amount of subscribers. So if you happen to have a YouTube account, go over to the BPEG page, hit subscribe, just to make sure that we can